The night they found him, the snow had buried the ridge clear to the top of the tallest pine. 6 men rode out, coats stiff with frost, faces wrapped in scarves, thinking they'd find a corpse frozen stiff in his saddle, or a pile of broken logs where the roof caved in. They didn't expect to find the smoke, not rising from a pipe or flue, but curling low and slow from a snowdrift, like the earth itself was exhaling. It wasn't until they got off their horses and scraped down with gloved hands that they found it, a chimney, buried to the cap under 5 feet of packed snow. And under that, a cowboy who should have been dead, but wasn't. They called him Birch. No one knew if it was his first name or last. Just Birch. He was the kind of man who didn't say much, didn't drink, didn't play cards, lived up on Horseshoe Ridge in a cabin he'd hauled himself, log by log, mule by mule for 3 summers straight. Folks around Deadhorn called him the Chimney Fool after he started digging that trench. Said he was a mule-brained loner playing mountain mole. No proper man dug his chimney sideways and ran it out the ground like a groundhog's tail. But Birch never answered their laughter. He just kept building. They laughed hardest the day he capped it, dug a tunnel 6 feet out from the rear of his cabin, shored it with scrap iron and stone, then mounted a low iron flue that sat barely 2 feet above the dirt. Then he buried the whole thing in a hill of loose gravel and earth, patting it like a grave. One old rancher spit his tobacco and said, "May as well be a tombstone for the fool. Chimneys go up, not sideways." But Birch, same as always, just nodded once and walked back inside. That fall was colder than most. Snow started in October and didn't stop. Come January, the storms rolled in thick as smoke. They called it the Black Winter later. Livestock froze on their hooves. Townsfolk burned fence posts and books. A family of 6 perished in a schoolhouse when the door ice shut and no one heard their pounding. And up on Horseshoe Ridge, Birch stayed put. Folks in Deadhorn watched the ridge with spyglasses, wondering when they'd see the smoke stop, wondering how long a man could last alone in a cabin where even the roof disappeared beneath the drifts. They bet silver coins on it, how many days till Birch froze to death. Someone even nailed a sign to the saloon wall that read, "Birch's ghost chimney, 2 to 1 odds he's dead by next Sunday." But the smoke never stopped. Didn't rise like a tower, didn't curl like a fire signal. It leaked, low and steady, from that weird buried mound behind his cabin, like the earth was still warm under all that frozen white. The more it snowed, the more they wondered. Was he using a stove buried under the ground? Was he alive? Was it even smoke? Or just the heat of his cabin escaping like breath from a grave? It wasn't until the snow cut off the North Trail and the McKinley boy's horse came back alone that the town got serious. Birch had ridden up to bring medicine to the boy's family, quinine and laudanum, promised he'd be back in 2 days. The horse returned 4 days later, reins trailing, eyes wild. That's when the 6 men rode out. What they found wasn't what they expected. The snow was so thick the usual landmarks were gone. No trees, no ridgeline, just white mounds and blowing silence. But they found a patch of warmth, almost felt before seen. The air shimmered ever so slightly in a spot where the drift bent wrong. They dug there, thinking they might be too late. Then the iron cap of the chimney poked through. One man said it must have been hell inside. The air so thin, the smoke so low, the weight of snow pressing down like a coffin lid. But when they pried open the side hatch, a little iron door Birch had welded from an old stove. The heat that hit them was like a punch. Warm air, dry and smoky, burst out. And behind it, a man, pale, eyes sunken, wrapped in pelts and blankets, beard full of soot, standing with a shotgun pointed steady at the light. They shouted to him, and he lowered the weapon slowly. Didn't smile, didn't say anything for a long while, just leaned on the doorframe and stared at the 6 men like they were ghosts. Then, as if remembering something, he stepped back and said one word. "Boy!" He collapsed before they could answer. They found the McKinley boy, alive in Birch's cabin, tucked into a corner near the fire, cheeks flushed, wrapped in 4 layers of fur. Birch had carried him up the ridge before the storm thickened, left the horse tied at the bluff, and hiked the last mile on foot with the child strapped to his back. He'd made it inside just before the whiteout. The boy said Birch never slept, just fed the stove, checked the tunnel, melted snow for water, kept everything sealed, said the chimney never smoked inside, said the snow never leaked through. When they asked Birch later, after he'd come to, after his hands stopped shaking, why he built it that way, he said one thing: "Because I knew the sky'd betray me, so I built downward." Nobody mocked him after that, but there was more to it. Birch hadn't just buried a pipe, he'd engineered a miracle. He'd watched the way cold moved, the way fire choked in high winds, the way regular chimneys clogged with ice or reversed when snow sealed the roof. He'd listened to the old Kiowa tales about ground heat and the stone-breathing shelters, and he'd built something no man in Deadhorn had imagined, a warm tomb that breathed under the storm. The truth came out in pieces, the metal fins he used to catch heat, the gravel layers that prevented meltwater seepage, the tiny side vents hidden like gopher holes for draft control. But none of it mattered as much as what he'd done. He'd kept himself and a boy alive for 12 days, under snow that could snap pine trees in half. And when the storm finally broke, and folks started digging out, the saloon sign came down, the betting coins went quiet, and Birch, once called Chimney Fool, once left for dead, became something else entirely. But even after all that, he didn't come down into town, didn't gloat, didn't claim reward, didn't even collect his own horse. He just went back into that buried cabin, fed the fire, and vanished beneath the snow again, because he knew something the others didn't. The worst storm hadn't come yet. The morning after they pulled Birch and the boy from beneath the drift, a cold wind cut through Deadhorn so bitter it cracked windows and split fence posts like brittle twigs. Horses refused to leave barns. Chickens froze solid on the perch. It wasn't a night storm anymore. It was the endless kind, the sort that sank down and settled like a curse, not an event. Birch lay unconscious in the church infirmary for 2 days, jaw clenched so tight they thought he'd die with his teeth locked. When he came to, he didn't speak at first, just stared through the boarded window like he was trying to see through the wood to the ridge. The boy, Micah McKinley, never left his side. When the preacher asked Birch what he'd seen up there, what he'd been through, Birch just said, "You ain't seen snow till it gets inside your thoughts, makes a home in you." The preacher didn't ask again. By the 4th day, whispers started in the saloon. Not about the chimney anymore. That talk had dried up. Now it was about the other cabins, the ones that didn't have fancy buried tunnels or smart engineering. Cabins with frozen stovepipes, cracked hearths, snow pushing in through rafters. The storm hadn't just knocked, it had settled. A few ranchers tried packing their chimneys with mud to slow the wind reversal. Some covered the mouths with sacks and wire. None of it worked. The smoke still backdrafted, filling cabins with fumes or freezing over entirely. Meanwhile, folks remembered Birch's buried pipe, how it hadn't failed, how the snow hadn't hurt it. One by one, men who'd once mocked him started asking questions. The blacksmith tried to sketch what little he knew. The banker offered cash for a look inside the cabin. The sheriff himself sent a man up the ridge to take notes. But when the scout returned, he said Birch had sealed everything again. The chimney was gone beneath a fresh wave of snow. No smoke, no signal, just quiet. They feared he'd gone and died again. But Micah said no. The boy had slept there. He knew the sounds, knew the rhythm of the heat when it exhaled through the gravel mound. He told the preacher to wait. "It's not dead," he said. "It's just breathing different." Birch didn't come back down, not even when the deputy rode up to offer him coin for advice, not even when old widow Hemlin's roof caved in and her children were pulled out blue-lipped and gasping, not when 2 cabins burned from makeshift, venting, flames snuffed in seconds by snowfall but smoke still clinging to rafters and clothes. Birch stayed quiet. Some said he was bitter, some said he was waiting, but in truth, Birch was building again, because what he saw in the storm hadn't been some miracle of survival. It had been a preview. The wind on Horseshoe Ridge was shifting. Every hour, it came from a new direction. East winds followed by north, then swirling west, then stillness. That stillness was what scared him most. Wind kept snow moving. Stillness let it fall in silence and stack like punishment. He dug out the chimney tunnel again, reinforced the sidewalls with scavenged stone. He laid a double layer of bone-dry brush between the gravel and vent lip to act as a thermal breaker. He even carved a second passage beneath the cabin, angled downward, so if the snow fully sealed him in, the pressure could find a route out without collapsing the cabin roof. And when he was done, he sat in the dark with a candle and counted matches. 4 dozen left, enough to restart the stove if something went wrong, but not enough to waste. So he practiced lighting the stove from memory, eyes shut, breathing low, counting seconds between each flint spark and coal shift, until he could do it in the dark with frozen fingers. Because the worst hadn't come, not yet. That Sunday, a man froze in the middle of town just trying to cross from the general store to his buggy. Fell over dead. No mark on him, but stiff as iron. The doctor said his lungs must have flash-frozen from the wind. Nobody argued. Then the horses began dying, not from cold exactly, but from something deeper, like their will to move was being smothered. They stood still in barns, eyes dull, and just leaned against the posts until they gave way. Chickens froze, dogs vanished. Only the crows stayed, perched black on the snowbanks, watching like sentries. The mayor called an emergency town meeting, said they needed to build shelters, pool heat, gather firewood, ration food, said they needed volunteers to ride out and scout cabins in the hills. But half the men who'd once joked about Birch's buried chimney didn't answer. Some were already coughing dark, some were holed up with family, some had started digging beneath their cabins, not knowing what to look for, just copying the shape they remembered from gossip. But they didn't have Birch's map. He had it, not a real map, but lines and diagrams and numbers scratched into hide and birch bark, stashed in an iron box behind the stove. Years of watching smoke curl and turn, drop, and spin. Wind tunnels he'd traced by torchlight. Pressure gaps he'd studied during autumn tempests. The buried chimney hadn't been an invention. It had been the final piece of a system built on years of obsession. And now, it was about to be tested. Micah returned on the 6th day. He'd hiked alone, back up the ridge, against the preacher's advice. Slipped out while the town was sleeping. Said Birch needed help, that the cabin wouldn't hold through the next wave, that he'd seen frost climbing the inside of the door, something Birch had said would only happen when the earth's warmth gave out, and the warmth was failing. He reached the ridge by dusk and knocked once. Birch didn't answer. Micah waited, knocked again. The door creaked open. The cabin was dark inside, not cold, but not warm either. Birch sat by the stove, eyes closed, breathing slow. A single candle flickered beside him. He opened one eye when Micah stepped in and said nothing, just nodded, then pointed toward the hatch. "Seal it," he whispered. Micah closed the door and turned the iron bolt. Then Birch stood. "We got one shot," he said. "Help me feed it." They worked all night, not just fueling the stove, but adjusting the chimney gates, checking the tunnel draft, tightening the seal on the water pots so the steam wouldn't backdraft. Birch had built everything to move, vents that could rotate, a buried basin that collected melted runoff, even a rope-pulled flap that could redirect warm air beneath the floorboards instead of up into the loft. Micah watched, learned, mirrored his movements. He wasn't a boy anymore, not after what he'd lived through, and Birch never treated him like one. When morning came, the snow was gone, not melted, but vanished, like the sky had swallowed it. The world outside was still white, but the falling had stopped. The stillness wasn't silent anymore. It was wrong. The air felt hollow. Birch stood at the hatch and listened, not to the wind, but to the lack of it. "This is it," he whispered. Micah didn't ask what he meant, because the ridge began to groan. Not loudly, not like thunder, but low, like a whale singing beneath miles of sea. The snow was shifting. Birch grabbed the boy's arm and yanked him away from the wall, just as the first beam buckled. The roof held, but barely. Snow had stacked against the slope, rising above the cabin's peak and curling over like a wave mid-break. They ducked into the stove tunnel. Birch grabbed 2 torches, lit both, and wedged them into side sconces. "We seal the inner hatch," he said. "If the roof gives, the stove tunnel keeps us alive. If it doesn't, we crawl back in. You understand?" Micah nodded, and they waited. Outside, something cracked. A branch? A beam? They couldn't tell. The sound was warped by weight. The air grew tight. Birch touched the chimney pipe with the back of his hand, still warm. Then he pressed his ear to the gravel mound and closed his eyes. He whispered, still breathing, and then came the sigh. It wasn't from them. It came from the snow itself. A long, drawn-out groan of pressure releasing as the upper ridge avalanche let go, spilling down in a slow, sweeping wave of white and weight and force. The buried chimney mound shuddered but held. The tunnel rocked. Birch pulled Micah closer, covered his head, and braced, and then it passed. Not a full collapse. Not yet, but a warning, a message. The chimney tunnel had survived, barely. When they emerged hours later, the world had changed again. The cabin was no longer visible at all. The only thing left was the iron hatch and the curve of the chimney mound, like 2 strange fossils on a sea of white. But the stove was still lit, and in town the sky began to darken again. 3 days after the ridge shook and the sky fell silent again, the snow returned. Not in drifts, not in flakes, but in sheets, thick as ash, dense as wet wool. It came sideways and downward at once, spiraling and hissing like something alive. Folks in Deadhorn stopped calling it a blizzard. They just called it the white, because it wasn't just cold anymore. It wasn't even weather. It was something else, something that came for you. Fires failed. Doors froze shut. One man stepped outside to check his ox and never came back. They found him crouched under a buckboard with his hands frozen around the reins, eyes still open, like he was staring at something terrible in the white that none of them could see. No one asked where the ox had gone. By now, Birch knew what was happening. It wasn't just a storm, it was a test. The mountains weren't offering mercy that winter. They were cutting the fat off the land, shaving off every mistake, every weak joint, every poorly nailed door and improperly sealed flue. If you hadn't prepared long before the snow came, you were just waiting to die. And so Birch didn't wait. He started digging again, this time not to open up the stove tunnel, but to finish something he'd once sworn he wouldn't try. A second chimney. Not for the stove, but for airflow. A draw tunnel. He hadn't built it before because it required crawling 30 feet beneath the cabin, sloping downward into an ancient rock cleft he'd found years ago. A natural fissure, warm air seeping through it even in deepest winter. He'd once followed it for hours, just with a rope and torch, and found it opened near the creek bed, under a stone shelf so low no snow ever reached it. He called it the lung, because even when the storm smothered everything, that fissure still breathed. He'd sealed it up back then. Too dangerous, he thought, too deep. A wrong collapse, a misstep, and the cabin would fall into the ground. But now danger was just what you gambled if you wanted to live. Micah helped dig. Side by side, they worked with hands wrapped in hide, faces wrapped in tallow-soaked cloth to trap heat, knees bruised from crawling under beams no higher than a coffin lid. They tunneled down into the earth itself, past the frost line, past the old stones, down where no wind reached, and the dirt still smelled like dirt, not death. Each time the roof above groaned under fresh snow, they paused, listened, and dug again. The tunnel took 2 days. Birch almost didn't make it. He passed out once in the crawl space too. Weak to call for help, Micah dragged him back by the boots, arms trembling, crying and coughing, lungs full of smoke and dust. Birch came to slowly, muttering numbers. 6 feet, 6 feet wide, damper at the 4th turn. When he could finally speak again, he said, "We seal it with brush and gravel. Let it draw from below. It'll suck warmth from the land, keep the draft moving, even when everything up top's frozen shut." Micah didn't fully understand, but he trusted him. By the 3rd night, the air inside the cabin changed. Warmer, drier. Birch lit the stove again, and this time the flame rose straight and clean. No flicker, no sputter. He opened the buried flue slightly, then the lower vent, the new one, and the cabin exhaled. The buried chimney finally had a lung. That night, as Birch sat with his back against the wall and Micah snored under the table, he felt something strange, not warmth, not safety, something older, the sense that the earth itself was watching, that the stones had taken him in, that he had passed a test the mountains didn't usually let men survive. But just as he closed his eyes, the knock came. It wasn't on the cabin door, that was buried. It came from above, from the snow. At first he thought it was cracking timber, but it came again and again, 3 hard knocks, then silence. He bolted upright, pulled on boots, grabbed the iron rod from beside the stove and moved toward the hatch. Another knock, but softer, desperate. Micah woke with a gasp. "What is it?" Birch held up a hand. A final knock, faint, hollow, then nothing. They waited. Birch pried open the tunnel hatch, crawling toward the buried chimney. He pushed aside the gravel at the mound's edge, letting in a sliver of nightlight. Then he saw it, a hand, frozen stiff, fingers blackened, gripping the iron vent. He dropped the rod and dug with bare hands, gravel scraping his knuckles raw. Slowly he uncovered the body. A woman, curled half dead around the chimney, eyes closed, lips split, breath barely visible. He hauled her in. Micah helped strip her frozen coat, cut away her boots, wrap her in pelts. They fed her broth, drop by drop, until her jaw unclenched and her body started shaking. Hours later, she spoke. Her name was Rilla, from the east side of the pass, a ridge over none of them could see in storm or sun. She'd been traveling with her brother, trying to reach the mining camp on the western slope, but the storm had cut them off. Their wagon had overturned, horse gone. Her brother had tried to climb a pine to see the trail and fallen, leg broken. They'd taken shelter beneath the wagon. It collapsed on the 3rd night. She had wandered for 2 more. No food, no sense of direction. Just a glow, that's what she said. "I saw a glow under the snow. Not like fire, like breath. The land was breathing. I followed it." She'd crawled toward it until her hands touched warm metal, until she found the chimney, until she knocked. Birch didn't say anything for a long while. Then he walked to the stove, stoked it higher and muttered, "We're out of pelts." The 3 of them sat in the cabin, day after day, listening to the wind outside scream like it was made of teeth. The tunnel vents held. The heat never died. The buried flue kept drawing. The lung kept exhaling. But food was running out, and Birch knew what came next. "I'll go," he said. Micah and Rilla both refused. Said he was half dead already, said the storm would shred him. But Birch just smiled, the first real smile Micah had seen on the man's face. "I built this to keep people in," he said. "But now it's time it let someone out." He packed hard biscuit, tallow strips, a tiny flask of lard, wrapped his legs in canvas, and tied the snow mask tight. Then he crawled through the chimney tunnel and vanished into the white. He didn't head for town. He went the other way, toward the wagon. He found the boy's brother 3 hours later, unconscious, barely breathing, wedged beneath the collapsed frame. A fox had already chewed one arm. Birch dragged him free, tied him into the sled he'd lashed together from scrap boards, and turned back. The blizzard fought him. It clawed his scarf off, burned his lungs, drove needles into his skin. But he followed the landmarks in his head, the buried pines, the warped ridge, the split boulder that looked like a woman's back. He moved like a man who'd lived this trail 100 times. And when he reached the cabin again, Micah and Rilla dug him in, pulled the rope, hauled the brother down. He lived, barely. 2 days later, the storm stopped. Not slowly, all at once. The wind died mid-scream. The sky opened. The light returned. And on that morning, when the sun hit the ridge for the first time in weeks, the people of Deadhorn saw something they didn't understand. A plume of smoke, rising straight up from a patch of snow, from a mound, from a buried hill that should have been nothing. They sent men, they followed the smoke, and they found the hatch. They opened it, and Birch, exhausted, covered in ash, greeted them with the same steady stare he'd always worn. Behind him stood Micah, Rilla, and a boy with one broken leg but fire in his eyes. The mayor tried to speak. Birch just raised a hand. "Don't need thanks." He turned back toward the stove. The men looked around, touched the tunnel walls, felt the warmth, the stone, the gravel, the hidden draft, the breathing. No one spoke. They didn't know what to say. They just knelt there in silence, staring into the tunnel of the man they'd once called a fool. The thaw came late that year. February crept in quiet and mean, with sun that looked warm but bit worse than shadow. Snow didn't melt. It sagged. Ice didn't break. It thickened in place, turning cabins into quiet tombs of frost and half-whispered prayers. Even when the sky cleared, no one trusted it, not after what they'd seen. But on Horseshoe Ridge, the buried cabin remained, alive, warm, breathing, like some strange animal under the mountain's hide. And inside it, the man who'd once been mocked as a fool found himself the center of a quiet, spreading storm of a different kind, one made of questions, rumors, and footsteps crunching up the trail every day. They came in 2s and 3s at first, then by the dozen: cowboys, trappers, wives holding infants, coughing children, an old woman whose skin looked like yellow paper. They came not to gawk, but to learn. They'd seen the smoke, they'd heard the story, and they wanted to survive. Birch didn't say much, but he didn't turn them away either. He'd cleared a side space in the tunnel, not quite a room, just a branching hollow he'd once considered storage, and that's where he put them. One by one, families huddled into the walls, not for comfort, but for warmth and for air that didn't try to kill them. Micah and Rilla worked like soldiers, heating broth, rationing fat, tending the boy's wounded leg. Rilla never once asked why Birch had gone back for her brother. She just sat by his side and pressed her hand into his every time he shivered. They didn't ask Birch where he got the strength to drag so many people through a tunnel meant for one, how he moved stones at night, how he carved a second air gap with nothing but a pickaxe and his bare shoulders. But they saw it, how the veins in his neck stuck out when he pried up a slab of shale, how his breath steamed through the scarf like some machine that couldn't stop, wouldn't stop, not until every warm soul was inside. And so Birch built a second vent, then a third. He mapped airflow on the inside of the tunnel with soot and finger marks. Where smoke lingered, he opened a flap. Where wind pulled too fast, he narrowed the neck. Micah watched him work and started learning the rhythm. Not just tools, but instinct. "It's not about heat," Birch told him once as they pressed gravel around a vent lip. "It's about where it goes when it leaves. Cold don't kill you by touch. It kills you when it strangles the air your fire needs." And the others listened. Quiet, reverent. The same men who'd once laughed now took notes on scraps of feedbag. A blacksmith from Cedar Hollow cried when Birch showed him how to bury a flue in gravel and still keep the draft from reversing. Birch didn't charge them. He didn't accept gifts. He only asked one thing: learn it right and teach it forward. He said it to every man who left, every woman who kissed his cheek and turned back down the ridge to rebuild what was left of their lives. Learn it right, teach it forward, like a commandment passed in the firelight. But the town didn't understand. Down in Deadhorn, they heard stories, saw the trickle of survivors returning with strange tales about a buried chimney, about warmth that came from the dirt, about a man who drew breath from stone. And the talk started up again, not the mockery this time, but something close, a different kind of disbelief. "He's exaggerating. No one could build that alone. He must have had help from trappers. They found a cave, or worse. It's not safe. He's tampering with God's order." The preacher preached caution. The sheriff warned of collapse risk. A council was formed, the Structural Concerns Board. And behind it all, the banker, Ellis Tern, the same man who once tried to buy Birch's Ridge and mine it for iron, stood and spoke like he'd been waiting for this moment. "He's a liability," Tern said. "We can't have people burying their chimneys and causing subsidence. If that ridge gives, it'll flood the valley with rock slide and ice melt. I say we bring him down for questioning." The town hall erupted in shouts, some in favor, some against. And through it all, Micah's father, newly recovered, stood in the back with a crutch and didn't say a word, until the moment came and he stepped forward. "I carried my brother out of that cabin with both lungs still breathing. I saw what it was, and you've all got the gall to sit here warm in your walls and call the man dangerous?" Tern sneered. "Emotion doesn't change facts, but the tide had shifted. Half the town had already begun burying their own vents, quietly, carefully. The ridge method, they called it. Not openly, but enough to spread. So Tern did what bitter men always do. He made it personal. He sent a man, not a marshal, not a deputy, just a hired hand with a warrant written in ink, signed with nothing but the town seal, claiming public endangerment through unlicensed architecture. He knocked on Birch's buried hatch in the dead of dusk, and Birch, covered in soot and ash, opened it. The man read the warrant. Birch stared at it, then walked back inside and shut the hatch. The man didn't knock again. By morning, word had spread. A delegation formed, not from the council, but from the people. Families who'd survived. People whose children slept through the storm because of what they learned. And they marched, not with pitchforks, but with shovels and gravel and stones. They walked up the ridge and helped Birch build. That was the day the chimney became more than a flue. It became a monument, not in marble, not in storybooks, but in smoke. The smoke that rose from that buried mound now curled in a ribbon, not from one cabin, but from dozens. Birch helped them dig vents, laid gravel paths, showed them how to bank heat in stone, and circulate airflow through pits dug deep into the mountain. He taught them how to build warmth that didn't come from fire alone, but from air that moved right, earth that breathed right, bodies that understood how to feed a space instead of choke it. Rilla helped tend the children. Micah became a second pair of hands for every new build. And Birch? He moved quieter, slower, but still, always moving, until the night came when he didn't. Micah found him slumped beside the stove, hand resting on the iron damper, face turned upward toward the ceiling, as if he were watching something no one else could see. He wasn't dead, but he wasn't entirely awake either. He whispered. "The mountain breathes," he said, "but only for those who listen." Micah carried him to the cot. Rilla sat beside him for hours, dabbing sweat from his brow. He didn't stir again that night, but the heat stayed. The vents worked. The buried chimney never failed, and for the first time in weeks, no one in Deadhorn died of cold. The final thaw began like a rumor. First came the dripping, faint and uncertain, not from the rooftops or trees, but from the chimneys themselves, the buried ones, where snowpack began to weep and shift. Then came the softening of snow at noon, like a breath had passed over the valley. It wasn't warmth, not really, just a change in pressure, a new tilt in the sky, a loosening of winter's grip, as if the storm, satisfied with what it had taken, had finally stepped aside. On Horseshoe Ridge they felt it first, in the vents where the draft eased, in the tunnel where the frost no longer bit through hide, and in Birch, who opened his eyes for the first time in days, exhaled once through cracked lips, and asked one question. How many? Micah was ready. 33, counting the little ones. Birch nodded, slow. All warm? All warm? He tried to sit up and failed, but he smiled. That'll do. Over the next 2 days, the settlers on the ridge began to emerge. Not all at once, not with cheers or songs, but careful, blinking into the brightness of a snowfield that now glittered instead of growled. They dug outward from vents, pried open tunnel hatches, and one by one, like seeds pushed through frost, the survivors stood. Deadhorn sent a rider with a wagon to check the ridge. When he returned, he told the town, "They're alive, all of them. There's even a baby, born in one of the vent rooms. They say it cried first in warm gravel." People cried, others doubted, but no one laughed anymore. The mayor himself rode up the next morning with 3 others and a sled of supplies. They found Birch seated on a log outside the hatch, wrapped in furs, his beard frosted with vapor. He was thinner, paler, but upright, watching the sky. He didn't rise when they approached, didn't have to. The mayor doffed his hat. The others followed. "Birch," he said, voice unsteady, "there's a matter of recognition. We don't want it." The mayor blinked. "Pardon?" "Don't want thanks or reward. Don't need my name carved into any sign." He paused, squinting at the sun. "I want one thing, one only." The mayor waited. "Put it in the school books," Birch said. "Not my name, not the storm, the chimney. Teach it right. Let every child learn how to build the kind of fire that doesn't burn a roof down when it's buried under the sky. That's all." The mayor didn't argue. No one did. They wrote it down. And that spring, when the snow melted and the ridge turned green again, men from as far as Fort Pike came to study what had been done. Not engineers, not professors, just settlers, blacksmiths, preachers, fathers, and widows who'd lost too much to leave the future to luck. They took notes, copied vent designs, sketched trench angles, and measured draw tunnels. Birch didn't stop them. He only asked again and again, "Learn it right. Teach it forward." Micah became the teacher, Rilla the builder. Her brother, once nearly gone, limped through the tunnel paths like a man reborn, laying stone and stacking gravel with one good arm and no complaint. The boy from the mining family, he grew up there. They called him Flint because he sparked his first fire at 3 years old, in the buried chamber where Birch had first built the flue. As for Birch himself, he changed. Not loudly, not fast. He still spoke in few words, still sat alone sometimes, staring at the ridge like it whispered things no one else could hear. But the hard edge in him softened, and sometimes in the quiet hours after smoke rose clean and the air warmed gently through the stones, he told stories about the Kiowa elder who'd once spoken of Earth's breath, about a winter long ago when his own father froze in a shack because the pipe iced over in a single night, about digging with frostbitten fingers, not because he believed he'd live, but because he didn't want to die sitting still. And people listened, not just with ears, but with hands. They rebuilt Deadhorn that spring with knowledge from the ridge, chimneys buried in stone and gravel, stove tunnels laid low like veins beneath the earth, dampers built from iron hinges, flue caps bolted at shallow angles to prevent ice blockages. Not every home followed the ridge method exactly, but none ever again ignored the lesson. The banker, Ellis Turn, left town under cover of night after the thaw. His warrant was never enforced. The preacher rewrote his sermons to include lessons on humility, invention, and the fire that does not boast but endures. And on the first anniversary of the storm, when a small brass plaque was placed beside the town square's new community stove, it read, "To the man who listened when the mountain breathed." But Birch never saw it. He stayed on the ridge. That spring, Micah asked him why he never came down. Birch just looked at the vent, watched the steam curl into the cool morning, and said, "If I go down there, I might start thinking I beat the storm." He shook his head. "But the storm ain't something you beat. It's something you understand." Years passed, and on the fifth winter after the blizzard, when a similar storm began creeping down from the north, the valley was ready, not because of warnings, not because of new tools, but because every child knew how to dig a stove trench, because every settler kept gravel in a sack beside their kindling, because every chimney had a lung now, some low, some shallow, but all built with the same care Birch had once carved from earth and desperation. And when the storm hit, fierce and sudden, not a single family froze. Afterward, a man climbed Horseshoe Ridge with his son to tell Birch the news. But the hatch was open, the tunnel cold. Inside the cabin, the stove was dark, clean, unused for days. The iron vent had cooled completely, and Birch's bed was empty. There was no note, no sign of struggle, no blood. Just one thing, a handprint in soot pressed into the stone above the damper, like someone steadying themselves for one last breath before walking out. No footprints led away, just wind, and when they stepped outside, the boy pointed to the flue mound and said, "It's still warm." The father bent down, pressed his palm against it. He nodded. "It is." They never found Birch again. Some say he went higher, to the pass beyond Horseshoe, where snow never melts and the sky breaks open with silence. Others believe he walked into the stone itself, carried by the mountain he listened to so long. But every year after, when the first frost touched the ridge, a wisp of smoke would rise from the old chimney, even though no one lived there. A reminder, not of a man, but of a lesson. How to build warmth that the storm can't steal. How to breathe when the world stops. How to dig deep when up leads nowhere. And so, in homes across the valley, where children now sleep warm through winter's worst, they pass it down like a prayer. Learn it right, teach it forward,